Uhuru comrades, welcome to today's webinar with Chairman Omali Yeshitela themed Abortion, African People Pregnant with Revolution, where we're discussing the African People's Socialist Party's position to the Supreme Court leaks draft on Roe versus Wade. Joining the chairman in today's live event will be Yejide Orunmila, president of the African National Women's Organization and member of the National Central Committee of the African People's Socialist Party. President Yejide just led a powerful march called the Black Mothers March on the White House this past Sunday. Today, the party will address this question of the repeal of abortion rights and what this means for African families who live under colonialism inside the US, in Africa, and around the world. We will sum this up in the context of the chairman's analysis of colonialism as the mode of production and the understanding that the current social system is built and maintained on the enslavement of African people and the colonial domination of the majority of the peoples of the world. Roe v. Wade was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. This ruling came at a time when the anti-colonial struggle of African people for power inside the US and the world in the 1960s was a leading force of the main trend in the worldwide movements for independence and national liberation. The liberation struggle of African people opened the door for other national liberation movements and even for white women and LGBTQ. On May 2nd, 2022, an initial draft majority opinion penned by Justice Samuel Alito was leaked to the colonial media. The document suggested that the Supreme Court has the unity to overturn Roe v. Wade in a pending final decision on another case expected to be decided by June 2022. This leak created a furor which Chairman Omali Yeshitela and President Yejide will dissect for us today. Before we get started, I want to call on you, our live viewers, to share this discussion far and wide. Like and share this video from the platform you're watching from, and tag people in the comment section to join. We know you have an opinion on this issue. You were probably in a debate with someone recently about it. Let's answer these questions. Let's get these answers out everywhere. We need your help to make this happen. Comment shared in the chat section once you've shared it. Now, it's my honor to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru Comment Director Akile, thank you for the introduction. And I just want to start off by saying that we are very clear that the opinions that we have regarding this question of Roe versus Wade, the question of abortion is quite different from what you'll hear from either side of debating this question within the United States, from those who abhor the notion of abortion and from those who think that abortion is a right, as white women like to say, affirming that every woman is my body and every woman has a right to choose. So our position is going to be decidedly different. We do not accept the status quo. We do not accept as something that has to continue to exist the rule by the United States government, the notion that somehow the Supreme Court can actively and effectively and honestly speak to the interests of African people any more than the police can do that, effectively represent our interests any more than any of the institutions in the United States. And I think it's really important for us to say in the beginning that the starting point for this discussion from our perspective of the African People's Socialist Party is to recognize that African people and all of humanity more or less live under a system that can be characterized as defined by a colonial mode of production. And by which we mean that everywhere in the world, when you see people involved in just struggling to live and make ends meet, people who, whether they're involved in YouTube and going to the movies or hanging out or just trying to get a job, trying to feed their families, et cetera, all of the political, social, economic activity that people are involved in occurs within a particular mode of production. And the mode of production simply means it's the process through which human beings engage in the production of life. And the fact of the matter is they struggle by human beings to produce and reproduce real life is the motive force, is the driving force in all human society. That is the determining factor. Regardless of what you may have heard in your latest Sunday school class or your latest civic study or something to that effect, that there is no thing that is more significant than the struggle for life, that is production and reproduction of life. And I think that if we understand that, going into this issue of Roe versus Wade and abortion becomes a little easier for us to understand. But when we talk about a mode of production, we're talking about the fact that societies are defined by the way they go about acquiring subsistence, by the way they go about acquiring the economic basis of that society, how that society gets its living. And that's the material basis, that's the economic base of society. But also related to the economic base, there's this thing that we refer to as a superstructure. And the superstructure, the ideas, the ideology, the legal institutions, things like that, even culture is a reflection of a superstructure. That is to say that people learn how to perceive the world in part based on what the economic basis of that society is. And there have been other modes of production prior to this colonial mode of production that goes widely unrecognized by most forces, and especially by most Europeans and most followers of some of the advanced thinkers of the European society, that they talk about feudalism as a mode of production. They've even talked about primitive communism or communalism as a mode of production. And they like to refer to what is occurring now in the world, what we live under as a capitalist mode of production. But what we want to say, and it's extremely important for us and for everybody to understand if we are indeed interested in changing what is happening in the world, not just one manifestation of oppression and exploitation, but the entire social system. You can't get to it unless you recognize that the fundamental contradiction is a colonial mode of production, that the world as we know it, the political economy as we know it, as we experience it in the world, is one that came into existence through colonial slavery. It was one that sent Europeans out in this thing that they like to call the era of discovery, especially coming from Portugal, to try to cure the economic crisis that was affecting what is now known as Europe. Was no Europe at this time, trying to affect this economic crisis. And it's an economic crisis that was born of a plague. And this plague from 1347, 1351 killed half the white people on earth in a short 4 years. And then subsequent to that, that and other plagues were devastating in Europe. And it destroyed, almost decimated the economy of Europe. And so Europeans were in a desperate strait. And they remembered something, certainly out of Portugal, this memory played an important role of this man who, in something like 1328, several years prior, perhaps something like 19 years prior, this man who left Mali with an entourage of 60,000 people and traveled more than 3,000 miles on camels and horsebacks and laden with gold and other kinds of gifts and brought gold and built mosque from Mali all the way to Mecca where he was traveling. And it was so much gold that it affected the value of gold in that part of the world for years and years to come. And so when Europe found itself devastated by the plague and economic devastation followed in the wake of the plague, a huge problem that they had to solve was how to get resources and the memory of that. Not this nonsense that they were somehow trying to find a way to the east, et cetera. They were trying to find that gold. When Portugal set out as one of the primary forces, and as you know, by 1415, Portugal had initiated the trade in Black people that became known as the slave trade, and most of Europe, most of what now is known as Europe, became involved in this process, and it moved from just off the coast of Africa, traveling around the coast of Africa, capturing people, setting up colonial entities in various places. Even Columbus got a start in Elmina and what is now known as Ghana, taking provisions to that colony of Portugal. And so pretty soon, over a period of time, we were not just looking at a policy about Portugal or some other entity, but a whole mode of production. This is how Europe began to acquire everything that it needed to exist. And it found some gold, it found lots of gold, it found other kinds of resources. You saw the development of sugar growth and importation that changed the diet of all of Europe. You saw the emergence of this thing that we call Europe that didn't exist before. This is the process that eliminated the primary contradiction existed between these white people who lived in this place that we now know as Europe. This primary contradiction that was a struggle between different ethnic groups, tribes, and what have you. And now it wasn't just an issue of the Normans and other ethnic groups, Celts contending with each other. Now we saw all of this thing that it comes together and achieves an identity as a part of engaging in the development of a new world economy. And this world economy was based on colonialism, and people like to refer to it as capitalism. But the fact is that what sticks the world together in a political economy was colonialism. It was Europe traveling around the world to the Americas and various other places, creating this colonial entity. This is the basis of it all. And if you can't get to that, we can't get to anything else. And this is extremely important for Africa and African people. This is the thing that makes it unnecessary for us to see ourselves as auxiliaries to somebody else's history. I mean, even when you look at Karl Marx, for whom I have tremendous amount of respect, who talked about how capitalism came into existence. He talked about this thing that he called primitive accumulation of capital. This primitive accumulation of capital he characterized as turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. He said other things. He said things like how wage slavery in Europe required as a pedestal slavery, pure and simple in the New World. In other words, the whole political economy of that being referred to as capitalism required as a pedestal the enslavement of African people. And of course, the colonization of much of the world. This is the economy within which we live. And then in this process, various kinds of institutions were created, but these institutions were created to facilitate a mode of production, a relationship. And it's a parasitic relationship that we're talking about that Europe has with Africa and most of the other oppressed peoples around the world. This is testimony, this is a statement that defines a mode of production. The colonial mode of production is a parasite. As Europe functions as a parasite resting upon the body of the rest of humanity globally around the world. And this functions as a political economy that starves and oppresses and kills Africans and other colonized people and bring all kinds of resources to Europe, even poor Europeans. And it's something that informs the consciousness and the psyche of white people, that helps them to understand who they are, that defines who they are. In this place that we call the United States, of course, it's not fundamentally different from what you can find in most of what is characterized as the Americas. But in this place that we talk about the United States, and we talk about the colonial mode of production, it's really important to understand this, because you can't understand the existence of this thing called the United States without understanding colonial mode of production. Because can you imagine a capitalism that came without the existence of the United States? The fact is that the United States came into existence through an assault on the indigenous peoples here. The indigenous people here, the colonization of this territory by Europe. I say the United States, but that's all over the Americas. This is the thing that gave rise to the system that we're talking about. And systems were created to justify, promote, propel, maintain the existence of this relationship of parasitism, life being taken from others to give to Europe and to white people in general. Of course, the white people have come simply a metaphor for the colonizer. That's what we're talking about, the colonizer. So when we look at this Roe versus Wade, and we look at it almost an element of hysteria by some forces, and for them, the big question is the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. It has to be the legitimacy of the Supreme Court because other than that, without that, you have to get to the crucial questions. And the question is the relationship that the United States government and the Supreme Court has to colonized peoples here in this country and around the world. The legitimacy of that entity is a fundamental question. And the legitimacy of that entity rests upon the existence of the colonial mode of production, the fact that Africans and other people are held under colonial domination. So here we are, colonized. And what did colonialism do for us? It destroyed the forms of our family. It destroyed the economic relationships that existed between African people, oftentimes referred to as communalism, primitive communism, etc. And under such circumstances, and we had a situation that Hillary Clinton has stolen from this horrible human being has stolen from, who takes the slogan, just like they take everything, that's what a parasite does, that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that's a statement, that's a position that comes from Africa, and that's a position that comes from African people, because no woman was left alone to take care of a child. No family bore the sole responsibility of taking care of a child. This was the responsibility of the community. That's what accountability meant. That's what a collective living meant. That's what social existence meant. Social society where we took care of each other. And even that is something that existed for a very long time in many places in the world. And you can find remnants of that even today in various places where African people live. And even today, there's a memory of that within the African community where people will talk about how a single mother didn't have a responsibility just to raise a child, that if a child went wrong on one side of the community, that child was punished by an adult in any part of the community. If a child was hungry in one part of the community, that child was fed by any part of the community. That's what this meant in terms of the kind of life and existence we had before this assault on the structures of our own existence. And now I mentioned that in part because what appears to be the only option that African women have, African people have, when you look at the question of abortion, is people talk about how African people are poor, and because we are poor, then we have to have access to abortions, et cetera. Well, the reality is that we've been poorer than that in the United States. We've been poor and had 10, 15 children women have had for a single family. But even during that era, during those times, we had a situation where the family was the whole community, that there was no such thing as a foster child, that child was always going to be taken care of by the community, by the family. And there was a sense of that. So it was not something extraordinary that one had to do. One had a child. It was not something extraordinary. How am I going to take care of the child? A child was going to be taken care of within the context of the ability of the entire people, the entire community. And the community working together has always been able to take care of ourselves and take care of our children. So we're talking about a mode of production. And with this colonial mode of production, it's very vicious. It's a parasitic mode of production. And all of the activity that happens in the society functions on the base, on the top of that colonial mode of production. So I think it's really important for us to understand that. Also, it's hypocritical. I look, and you've seen some of the discussion that's surrounded this issue of the significance of the probable rule versus Wade Supreme Court decision and its implications for the condition of existence of African people. You've seen the furor over the leaked decision document, and that joins the U.S. This furor is one that joins the U.S.-led war against Russia in sucking all of the air out of the political atmosphere within the United States and some other parts, some other areas of the world. This is the question. And we're looking at all kinds of hypocrisy, as I said earlier. In every area of the political spectrum, that dominates this discussion. Some Christian and religious moralists and other colonialists, bleeding hearts, they work to obscure the real contradiction by either proclaiming that abortions are ungodly abominations to be prevented by all means, legal and illegal, or that prevention of abortions undermines a host of religious principles, presuming to protect the lives of women, unborn children, and the poor. So you're coming from what they characterize as both the right wing and the left wing of the Christian colonizers. So this is how this discussion is happening. But as African internationalists, as I said before, and as revolutionaries, our party, the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, do not seek for explanations of human behavior and superstition, but through an examination of objective material phenomena. And one of the things that we're looking at, again, is a mode of production, but also we're talking about one of the things that influences this decision by the Supreme Court that seems to be pending is that the decline in the total fertility rate of women within the United States, that's below the 2.1 children necessary per woman necessary, thought to be necessary to maintain a stable population. And it's less than that. I think it's somewhere around 1.8 child per woman that's being born in the United States. And that has all kinds of implications, political, economic implications in the United States. So it's a real serious thing. This is part of the reason that you see these, the attack, how this affects the whole white nationalist colonial psyche, leading to mob-like mobilizations of white people declaring, "You will not replace us," marching in the streets with torches and things like that in various US cities. Now, this is a democratic crisis, and it's responsible for whites bombing abortion clinics and even killing abortion doctors in some instances. This is a part of the existential crisis of the colonial mode of production. That's what we're looking at. So it's not just some morality. We're looking at some actual things that's happening in the world. And we recognize in the African People's Socialist Party that the motivating force in human society is the production and reproduction of human life. And this is something that is a war against Africa and African people has been ongoing for such a long period of time. And so even though there's this inclination by liberal feminists and what have you to say that because African women, the ones who get an inordinate amount of abortions, that African women, that this attack on abortion rights is an attack on African women, on the one hand. On the other hand, there are these moralists, sometimes African moralists, but they are neo-colonialist wannabes. And then the so-called right-wing colonizers who say the inordinate amount of abortions Africans are getting is a representative of a certain kind of genocide. But the reality is genocide is a word, and I want to remind everybody that there was no such thing called genocide until white people started killing white people. And that came in the 1940s when European Jews were killed in Germany. And so this is where we see the acceptance of the term genocide. There was no word called genocide when you have even Belgium killing from perhaps 10, 12, 15 million African people in Congo. There was no word. There was no word called genocide between when the 1500s and 1600s, where more than 60 million indigenous people were killed by white people, by the colonizers throughout the Americas. There was no word called genocide. When you look at the numbers of human beings, Africans, who were slaughtered as a part of the process of capturing and developing this system. So now they want to get involved in the discussion of genocide, but they want to talk about genocide as something that in a way that contributes to the struggle that exists between colonizers themselves. And because it is an existential crisis for the colonizers, for people who accept the status quo that exists today, the social system as it exists today as permanent. For this is a crisis. Because if this is a permanent situation, there is no way out. There's no way out for white people, for white women. There's no way out for African people either. We say there is a way out. And the only way out is an attack on the actual social system that creates the contradictions and conditions that we live in and creates the legal and other kinds of systems, including what we refer to as moral, that dominates the world and dominates our lives today. So we are African internationalists. We say that what has to happen is that we have to join the African People's Socialist Party and see the future, and see a future that goes beyond, that goes through, that goes over, that crushes the reality of colonial mode of production that we are stuck with at this time. I think that's really important for us to understand. I mean, clearly, we've heard the arguments that African women make up this inordinate number of the women who are succumbing to abortion, and so the left colonizers, as we said before, claim is in the interest of African women to fight for abortion rights in opposition to the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And then the right-wing colonizers say that the abortion issue, Roe versus Wade, has genocidal implications, and therefore we should support Roe versus Wade. I'm saying that in the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, African internationalists say that we have to support ourselves. And the US Supreme Court does not represent our interests, nor do any of the other legal and other institutions that constitute the social system here represent our interests. We have to fight to win our own interests. And we recognize that African women are stuck in these situations, or appear to be stuck in this situation, because how are you going to take care of these children? Look at what happens to our people. Like I mentioned earlier, like Hillary Clinton, a murderer, a genocidalist, who talks about it takes a village to raise a child, but participates and has participated and continues to participate with a government that imposes all kinds of colonial conditions on the people. Hillary Clinton is the one who supported this whole notion of some kind of super predators being young Black children, and has been responsible for so many Black people, young people being imprisoned as a consequence of that kind of thing. That's no friend of ours. We have to become our own friends. We have to be able to fight in our own interests. And regardless of what the US Senate or the US Congress or what the Supreme Court does, we have to identify what our interests are. And if the US Congress, and if the US Supreme Court, and if the US Senate stands between us and our interests, it informs us that our responsibility is to make revolution to overturn this relationship, because we have to live. And the social system that exists now comes at our expense. It kills us on a daily basis. Abortion is just one of the things that can be talked about. Let me share something with you that was the Wall Street Journal had this interesting article today written by a right-wing wannabe neo-colonialist who makes this argument. This is an opinion piece, who makes this argument that Africans should be for the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And this is the same argument that's made by all of the right-wing colonialist apologists. And we deal with this question differently, but I want to see if I can get to this question from how the Wall Street Journal has handled this. And it starts off, this article is written by somebody who is named Jason L. Riley. And it starts off that says, Bill Clinton, well, I don't want to go to Clinton, but it talks about how this abortion ruling and abortion, he goes through this, how the white left of the left colonizers, he says the racial gap in test scores. He's talking about the racial gap in test scores. He said in the 3 decades since the US abortion rate has in fact declined, in recent years it's fallen to about half of what it was in the early 1980s, yet significant racial disparities persist. Significant racial disparities persist. In other contexts, group differences in outcome, set off alarms on the political left. This is the colonial political left. This is the political left colonizers. He says the racial gap in test scores has brought calls to eliminate the SAT and other admission tests. The racial gap in arrest and incarceration rates has brought calls to legalize drugs and reduce resources for law enforcement. Racial differences in wealth and income fuel progressive demands for slavery reparations and a larger welfare state, and so on. Said when it comes to abortion, however, left-wing concerns seem to stop at making the procedure safe. When it comes to abortion, however, left-wing concerns seem to stop at making the procedure safe and legal, while even black-white disparities have not only persisted but widened. So he talks about how there's a growth in this gap of who's getting abortions, and he talks conventionally about the number of African women, and they come up with these grotesque numbers and comparisons about African women being subject to abortion. But he is making the point for us because he talks about racial gap in test scores, racial gap in arrest and incarceration rates, racial differences in wealth and income. All of these, he's saying, are treated one way, but the abortion thing is treated another way. So he's right that the abortion question is treated another way by these left colonizers. But the point is, the gaps in every instance is a testimony to the colonial mode of production, that colonialism is responsible for everything. So how are you going to, the writer, is going to separate and take out the question of the gap with abortion rates and make this the critical question and overlooking all these other gaps that you're talking about, because all the gaps make a statement about the conditions of existence of African people living under colonial domination. We have to fight against that. So what we're saying in the African People's Socialist Party, we're not a pro-abortion or anti-abortion kind of movement. We're a revolutionary movement that's pro-independence, that for African people being in charge of our own lives, having the ability to create our own state, the ability to create our own courts, to make our own judgments about how we should be living and to carry that out. In order to do that, we have to eliminate the colonial mode of production that dominates every aspect of our life. That's what this party does. That's what the Uhuru movement does. That's why even going back for I don't know how many years now, we start creating entities that were that presuppose the fact that African people would be creating our own legal institutions, our own laws. What is the Supreme Court? When you talk about law coming from the Supreme Court, law is simply the opinion of the ruling class. And the colonial ruling class will never have law that satisfies the interests of African people. It might take on an iteration of a question that somehow helps white people, but it doesn't do a thing for me. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I was arrested for tearing down a 10-by-8 mural in the city of St. Petersburg, Florida. And I was arrested and charged with 11 different offenses. One of them was destruction of public property, and the other was grand larceny. But the grand larceny charge stemmed from the act of destruction of public property. So my lawyer took this to court and said that it was double jeopardy. The Supreme Court needed to be able to deal with this question of double jeopardy. So they said, if this is what happened, what I said, then it is indeed double jeopardy. So they sent it back to the court that sentenced me in the first place, and that court tried me again. So the point is that the Supreme Court, the system solved the problem that it needed to solve. Not for me. It didn't do a thing for me. I went back to trial again. It said I won the case. How the hell did I win the case since I'm being tried again? So I was, the thing was double jeopardy when they tried me twice. Now it's triple jeopardy because I'm being tried again because they had no need to solve a problem for me. They solve a problem for themselves. And this is what is happening with this debate, this issue that's happening with the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade and other issues. We have to assume responsibility for our own lives. We have to assume responsibility for the ability to take care of our own children. We have to assume the responsibility to get the Supreme Court and every other entity, colonial entity that dominates our lives off our backs. That's the way forward. So this is not just some ranting. As I mentioned earlier, we've created institutions, tribunals that we've put the U.S. government on trial and charged with genocide. Say, well, what good does that do? That's just a mock trial. No, that's not a mock trial. When they take you to court, that's a mock trial. It's a mock trial that they do. It's a make-believe trial because it ain't no trial for real. It's a make-believe trial, but the difference is they have the guns and the power to carry out their verdict. What we have to do, our trial is legitimate. Our institutions are legitimate. And the question is whether or not we will achieve the capacity and the power to carry out the verdicts that we establish for ourselves, to say that our children can live, will live. I was participating in the mobilization just last Sunday. That the African National Women's Organization, Chairman Yejide Orunmila is the chair of that organization. She'll be saying something a moment from now. But this was an incredible mobilization. And it's a mobilization because of this thing that they call Child Protective Services. Here we are as a whole people, African people, who are in the United States as a consequence have been kidnapped. And then now they are taking babies. This is something that's been going on forever, taking our children. And in fact, I couldn't be here in the United States without babies having been taken. So they're going to charge African women today with somehow being bad parents. The same women who were taking care of their nasty babies just a little while ago are now being told that we don't take care of our children well. This is where they are, right now in terms of dealing with us. But the fact of the matter is that we have the ability to serve our own interests ourselves, but we can't do that while solving the problems of the colonizers. So we have this incredible mobilization, the African women, African community being isolated, being shamed by the colonizer. Here is the kidnapper. Here is the murderer. Here is the looter. Here is the terrorist of the world now saying that African people are the terrorists and won't take care of our own children. And they come and they take our babies, they take our children. This is the same system that we're going to now talking about do right by us in terms of Roe versus Wade. They can't do right by us. So here's what we do. We create our own capacity. And it's slow. It doesn't jump off until you are ready, until the people are ready, but we keep pushing it and we keep putting forward the ability to make this happen. So how do we take this question on? Well, one thing that we do is that right now in St. Louis, we're involved in the struggle with creating doulas. So people can participate. We've got about 20 young women who, this is just in St. Louis, who are coming into the process to learn how to be doulas as a part of a community-wide effort so that we don't have to rely on the colonizers as much for that kind of thing. We create economic institutions so that people can begin to trade and buy from each other. This is part of what it is that we do. So we create childcare collectives. This is what we're saying. So how can a single mother has the responsibility of taking care of that child 24/7. And there are more African women who are single with that responsibility. We take it on by creating collectives, winning African people to come together in our communities and share child care responsibilities with each other, so that one woman is not the only one who is responsible. They take our children because they say, because we're in situations where you can't go and look for a job because you don't have a child care. If you go and take your child with you, you leave the child in the car, something happens, you go to jail for that. This is the kind of situation that they've created for us. They've destroyed and very effectively the social structures of our community. We have to reproduce those in a way that negates the power and influence of the colonizer. We have to attack the colonial mode of production. We have to negate the colonial mode of production by recreating the kind of system, the kind of communist system that we had prior to our introduction to this social system. I just want to say this. I talked about Karl Marx and talked about the respect that I have for Marx, but when he talked about this whole question of how capitalism came into existence, he called this thing a primitive accumulation of capital. And this he talked about, again, turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what he has done now is objectified our history. He has liquidated our history as a history of our own. He has made us a part of the history of the white man. He's made us a part of the history of the colonizer. So we become primitive accumulation in the development of capitalism, in the development of the social system that dominates the world from the perspective of the colonizer. We say, hell no, that we have to take charge of our own lives. We recognize there's a colonial mode of production. And if you don't understand this, then you always will perceive the world from the perspective of your oppressor and your colonizer. So what we're saying is that that the determination Roe versus Wade, it's a shaky situation. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. They have put us in situations where we thought we were free. They proclamation, some kind of proclamation of liberty by Abraham Lincoln that was liquidated when it became convenient for them to do that. Even the question of Roe versus Wade, if you think that was something good for you, look at it now. You ain't got it. The point is that the only future that we have is the future that we create for ourselves, and that's not going to be determined by the Supreme Court. It's not a question of abortion or not abortion, it's a question of revolution. That's what the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement are all about. That's what we're calling on you to join with us and take it on. We create our own structures that serve to negate the colonial structures of our oppressors. We must be free. We will be free. We are winning. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, just really want to appreciate, this really deep analysis. And I know that we're going to continue to go into it, but I just want to really express appreciation for it and just say that I unite. And when we look at the whole question, based on what you just summarized, that legal abortion or, none, the situation for Africans is the same. It is the same contradiction we're confronted with, whether you legalize it or not, whether it's taken away, whether you have the opportunity to get an abortion. The situation for Africans remains that we are living under the system of colonialism, that we're not able to produce and reproduce life on our own terms for ourselves. That's the problem. And that's where everything stems from the colonial mode of production. Every issue that people find themselves confronted with is connected to this. So just really appreciate you deepening it and bringing us back to center focus, because this is attempting to get us off track. We have to focus on making the African Revolution. So to help deepen this discussion, I want to bring up Comrade President Yejide Orunmila, President of the African National Women's Organization. Uhuru, President Yejide.
Uhuru, comrades. Oh, I get to go. Okay. All right, comrades. So thank you so much for that introduction. I just really want to appreciate the chairman and what he just presented. I think it just really provided a deep, profound history, historical materialist understanding of the colonial mode of production and what we're facing now as a result of that, not just in regards to the Roe versus Wade leak or anything like that, or even just the abortion question, because I think one of the things that's really critical for us to understand is that the conditions for African people are dire. Like the conditions of African people, because of the colonial mode of production, is always threatened. Whether you're in the womb or beyond the womb, whether you're an adult, we see our children get shot down in the streets. We see our children kidnapped. Every single day in our communities, we see African women targeted and criminalized, African people targeted and criminalized. The lives that we live is full of violence and deepening crisis because the imperialism is in crisis, and the colonial mode of production has continued to ravage our entire nation. And what, the struggle that we're in right now is fighting for the African internationalist mode of production, the mode of production in which African people begin to solve our own problems and not rest on colonial courts to decide for us what we are going to do in order to survive. And that's essentially what these discussions are centered around, whether or not the colonial law says to us whether or not we can have a child or whether we are going to face obstacles in these instances. When the reality is that the children that we do have, right, the children that we do have, that we birthed and that we put out there in the world underneath colonialism are always threatened. We are threatened as African people. We have to face violence every single day. We have to face the reality of our mortality every single day because we live under colonialism, and it is something that we have to contend with on so many different levels. And, you know, when I think about abortions and, you know, the conditions, the colonial conditions under which African women are forced to make decisions about their bodies, it's not because we are unilaterally outside or devoid of a system that continues to exploit and oppress. We're inside that system. So whether or not we have food in our kitchen, whether or not we have a partner in the home, whether or not we have enough money to take care of our children, whether or not we are suffering with some other sort of contradiction because of colonialism, these all come into play when we decide, when we think about like bringing children into this world. And so when you think about all of the things, whether or not we're in a domestic violence situation, all of these things have impact. You know, we work with African women all the time in the African National Women's Organization, particularly when it comes to this Arrest CPS campaign, and we see the damage that colonialism has wrought on African families, upfront and personal, and we see just the many layers. It's not just this question of children, right? It's what's happening to African women, what's happening to African men. There are so many different layers that go into this question about whether or not we can survive and take care of our children. And that's after they are born. And we are also confronted with these things when we are pregnant, when we are trying to build families, when we want to have these things. But because of what is happening around us, the conditions that we have to face, oftentimes, not oftentimes, some of the times, African women make decisions to have an abortion. And then, you know, a few years ago when we were facing this abortion ban, not we, but throughout the United States, there was this abortion ban that was sweeping through many different states. And a lot of people were coming out and saying, this is where African people are having the most amount of abortions. And if they put this ban on, just like the chairman said, if they put this ban on, then it's going to impact the way that African women are able to have access to these sort of things. And that's what the left colonizers were saying, and as a way to recruit African women into fighting side by side with them against the abortion against abortion. I'm sorry, fighting for the right to have an abortion. And, you know, I think that some of the things that we just have to remember is just that, you know, colonialism doesn't allow for us to make unilateral decisions for ourselves. Even the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, the schools that we go to, the way that we treat each other in society is all based on the overarching system of colonialism. And so when we look at our families and when we see that the two camps here, the camp of, oh, we are faced with all of these things. That's the reason why we should have more children, right? Like, this is the reason why we should not have abortions, or because we faced with all of these things, that's the reason why we shouldn't bring more children into the world. And even a few years ago, like I said, with the abortion bans that was going through the United States, that, you know, there were billboards that were thrown up that against abortion that was coming from the petty bourgeois, you know, African community, that was saying that the most dangerous place for an African child is the womb of an African woman, and that African women, basically targeting African women as the perpetrators of African genocide, which cannot ever be the reality that we understand as African people. That the genocide committed against African people has never been at the hands of African women or African men or African children. Has always been. Is you have to rest that in the hands of the colonizer. The white colonizer has always had their hands in the lives of African people, controlling life or death situation and reinforcing that with violence. They have been the ones that have committed genocide. They have wiped out entire populations of African people through the enslavement of African people. Millions of African people died in what they call the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of African people died or were maimed in Congo alone during the reign of Leopold, where millions of African people were killed in his conquest of the Congo. Millions of African people die in different situations in different years and just wiped off the face of the planet. And it's not African women that did that. It's not African men that did that. It's the colonial mode of production and the violence that it brings with it that ravages the entire African nation. So to say that African women are the reason why African people are experiencing genocide through this abortion question is complete and utter bullshit. And to say that, but we know that African people we want life. We want life. We want to be able to take care of our children. We want to bring life into the world. That's the very essence of who we are. We want to bring life and cultivate life and do the things that will encourage the life and reproduction of our people. But we're constantly faced with colonialism. And so the answer to that is to fight that shit. Fight it, bring it to its knees, destroy it, wipe it out, and create the conditions that will cultivate the life, produce life in our own way, in our own interest, like the chairman just said. And we're doing that within the Uhuru movement. We're doing that with the African People's Socialist Party, with the African National Women's Organization. So when we say you come out to support and to fight the system that is facilitating the state-sponsored kidnapping of African children, that's a question of reproduction and reproduction of African life, right? You need to come out and support that. You need to come out and fight side by side with African people who are trying like hell to rescue their children from the clutches of the colonizer. Every single day, our children are snatched from our homes from the colonizer. That is what we need to be fighting. And we need to create institutions. We need to create community that will prevent a colonizer from coming into our community to take our children, and to create these sorts of these sorts of splits in our community that will allow for their narrative to seep in. Because African people have to be able to build for ourselves. The decisions of the Supreme Court, just like the decisions of your local police, decisions that all these other colonial institutions create to uphold their society, has never benefited African people. Never. And I don't know why we would think at this point, at this juncture, that anything that they would say would influence us one way or the other. Whether Roe versus Wade is overturned or not, the conditions for African people will still be the same. We'll still be faced with the same contradictions. And so the answer is to make the African revolution. The answer is to destroy the colonial mode of production. The answer is to build dual and contending power institutions that raises up the power and the strength of the African nation, but also fight for an African internationalist mode of production, a mode of production that is encouraging of life, that supports life, that is cultivating a new world that will sustain, not just sustain African life, but the entire life of the planet. And that's the only thing that you can hope to achieve through the struggle to end the colonial mode of production. Because outside of that, what we're saying is that we're trying to fix these issues underneath with the permission of colonialism, that we need to be justified and verified by colonialism, and that we can't move or make decisions about our communities except for when we get these decisions from these entities that make decisions all the time against the lives of African people, all the time. So what are we doing in our capacity to build an infrastructure, to build a dual and contending power structure that will encourage life, that will lift up and carry the African nation to our rightful place, and as destroyers of colonial mode of production, destroyers of capitalism? So when so this abortion question, I think, is really tough for most people, because we are constantly faced with just our life in general. We are constantly faced with decisions, particularly as African women, who oftentimes are the sole caretaker of children, the sole responsibility, the sole responsibility of child rearing. And we also have to look at why that is. I think the chairman, and I always forget the number, but the chairman, I'm just going to do it in generalities, that the chairman always quotes this number about the ratio of African men to African women, which is something like, which is significantly less, right? Significantly less to the African men's population is significantly less than the population of African women, particularly in the United States. And that in and of itself is a form of birth control. That in and of itself has been orchestrated by the conditions that colonialism has created, where you see most of our men are missing. Missing could be that they are in jail. Missing could be that they are dead. Missing could mean a lot of other things that have removed them from the community. And African women now are forced to figure things out on our own. And most of that has been to lean on our families, who, by the way, can't always be there for us because of colonialism, right? Grandmama, you think she retired? She ain't retired. She got to work. Granddad got to work. Aunties and uncles got to work. Everybody is trapped in this colonial, this colonial cycle of producing for the colonizer. And because of that, we are not producing for ourselves. We're not cultivating for ourselves. We're not creating institutions under which we can usher in a different reality than what we're experiencing. And part of that is that, we don't know anything else, right? Like, we don't know anything else because of as in my lifetime, I've only known colonialism. I've only known the colonial oppression. And for us to think outside of that is what the African People's Socialist Party is saying. For us to build outside of that is what the African People's Socialist Party is calling on us to do. And that involves joining the African People's Socialist Party so that you yourself can have a vision of the future, can work toward a future where African people are free, where you yourself becomes an agent of creating that freedom for our people, that you are not sitting on the sidelines waiting for a decision from Supreme Court, or that you're not waiting for the cop, the jury, and you're not waiting for the judges in murder cases to say whether or not a cop is guilty. You're not waiting for a judge to say that whether or not you can have your child back. That we have to create the conditions in which African people can thrive. And in doing that, in struggling for that, in raising these political struggles that we have to make, we are building the fortitude of our people to push back, to destroy, to fight against the system that is has ravaged our entire existence since the beginning and the foundation of this system. So this abortion question is not just central to the whether or not we can, a fetus and a zygote, and whether that constitute movement in the womb and things like that. This abortion question is tied to the whole question of the colonial mode of production, as the chairman has, extensively talked about already. And so I think the next step is, like, what are we going to do about it? Is it just that we're waiting for our chance to be outraged either one way or the other, whether the decision is passed or whether it's knocked out, or are we going to be engaged in the process of creating life for ourselves? And in doing that, destroying the access that the colonizer has to us. And that requires being a revolutionary. That requires your commitment to the revolutionary struggle to bring down the system in solving the problems of childcare and I just want to say that solving these problems related to African women, African children is not the responsibility of African women alone. That this question around whether or not somebody can reproduce life for ourselves is not a question of African alone. The African women and African children are a part of the entire African community, and therefore the African community has a responsibility to create situations, conditions under which we can attempt to solve these problems, but also in the middle of that, organize for it so that we are pushing back, fighting, struggling, beating down, destroying the system that has for so long dominated and destroyed, us. But the African People's Socialist Party has been fighting, right? Has been putting everything into motion, has provided us an opportunity to see ourselves as upstanding African women and men who can participate in the revolution in many different ways. And you have an opportunity to join that struggle. You have the opportunity to participate in making the Supreme Court or any other court as related to the colonial institutions irrelevant in the lives of African people, because we have to create dual and contending power institutions ourselves. We have to create African internationalist institutions that solve the problems, that push back, that contend with the colonizer, and doing so again to destroy, help our people find an avenue that they themselves can see that the final conclusion, the only conclusion, has to be the destruction of colonialism, destruction of the colonial mode of production. And until that time, if we cannot see this struggle within that context, and we're going to continue to fight these cyclical things that continue to come up and outrage our people every month. It seems like every day there's some new thing, there's something that has been judged on, but something that can be overturned. There's always these things that shift, particularly the left colonizers' understanding the reality of what they've been able to achieve. But African people know that our struggle is not won, right? Like our freedom is not won. We are not free. And we have to get free. We have to do that not through wishful thinking, not through prayer circles, not through just voting. We have to do that by engaging in the process to destroy the oppressive colonizer system that has done so much to destroy us. And that the killing of African people, the kidnapping of African people has not stopped. And as the chairman mentioned, just over the weekend, we led this incredible mobilization called the Black Mothers March. We, the African National Women's Organization, led this incredible mobilization called the Black Mothers March in the White House, where African women, African fathers, African mothers, grandmothers, aunties, uncles came to Washington, D.C. to charge the US government with genocide. These are poor, working class African people who came from different places around the country, like California, Wichita, Kansas, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, Georgia, St. Petersburg, Florida, North Carolina, different places throughout the country, Texas and Arizona, different places around the country. They came to Washington, D.C. They took their pennies, their dollars, and they took every single thing they had just so that they could be in a place where they would not be isolated. That is a defining moment for African people who had thought that the US government had silenced them because they had taken their kids. We read the books about children being kidnapped during the slavery, and we're outraged by it. But here it is happening right now. African people in our community are experiencing what it's like to have their children ripped out of their hand and not being able to see them for years or ever again, not knowing what's happening. These people who have been silenced because if they talked about it, the state will come down on them, arrest them, criminalize them. They braved those fears. They overcame those fears, and they came to Washington, D.C. because this is where they knew that they can feel the power, Black power, that was necessary in order for them to understand the conditions under which they are living and what they can do to fight back. They want to fight back because that's where we are right now in this time. This moment is about fighting back. And even those of us who have the most to lose, our children to this system, are fighting back. And so, this is the call that we're making, that what we do to impact the lives of these folks who have had their children snatched away from them, what we do to impact the lives of women who may be vulnerable or families that may be vulnerable in our communities, is up to us. It's us that makes these decisions. It's us that cultivates the conditions under which we can produce and reproduce for ourselves. And no matter what decision is done in the Supreme Court, and the time is now. There's no more sitting on the sidelines. There's no more making twiddling our thumbs or trying to figure out whether or not we're going to do anything at all. The time is now that if you don't like what's happening, if you don't like these decisions that are happening, then it's your responsibility as African people to join the revolution, join the African People's Socialist Party, join the African National Women's Organization, join Impede Them, ACT UP, because these are the organizations that produce and reproduce life for African people. This is the only movement that has created these avenues for you to be a part of, so that you can be a part of the revolution that's going to free us, African people in your lifetime, in the chairman's lifetime. And so the time is now. There's no other waiting on that. So, this is just an incredible time to be an African and alive, and it's an incredible time to fight. There is nothing else out there for African people right now except for the African People's Socialist Party, African internationalism, that defines for us what we must do. It gives you the conditions under which, it gives you the whole playbook. Why are we here? What's happening to African people? It helps you as an African person tell other folks, where to go stick their whatever, right? It helps us understand and contextualize our lives. Why are things happening to us, and how can I be a part of changing that reality for people, for myself, for my children? And you just shouldn't be anywhere else other than this. So I just really appreciate being asked to be a part of this live today and to speak to this whole question of abortion, which is a personal question for many African women who have to make decisions about whether or not to have children. And I just want to tell those sisters that whatever your decision, it really isn't yours. Whatever it is that you are thinking, it really isn't yours. It is the conditions around us, the colonial mode of production that has influenced the way that we understand life, the way that we understand community, the way that we understand what we have to do in order to, promote life. It is something that has been defined for us, and that if we ever hope to have a society in which we are able to make decisions, truly our own decisions regarding our bodies, then colonialism has to be destroyed and wiped out. So uhuru.
Uhuru, President Yejide from the African National Women's Organization. Really appreciate this profound presentation, both from you, Chairman, and President Yeshitela. And we know that this is African internationalism. And I just want to, President Yejide, you just did a lot of it for me, but just encourage people to join the African People's Socialist Party, apspuhuru.org, or join the African National Women's Organization, join one of the mass organizations of the Uhuru movement to join this fight against the colonial mode of production. I just wanted to, add, this, because this is really important, because regardless of, where you find yourself around a personal choice of, to have an abortion or to not, the fact is that we have to stay on focus in terms of what the fundamental contradiction is for African people. And regardless of what the outcome of, this vote that happens, whether it's overturned or not, and what majority of the white left colonizers are pushing for is that the vote, that it doesn't get overturned. And so what's happened for ages is that these rights of the colonizer population are fought on top of the pedestal. They're fought at the expense of the interests of African people, the long-term interests of African people. So you have the colonizer left who are fighting as a part of legitimizing, this colonial settler state, part of legitimizing it by fighting for the ability to obtain a legal abortion remain in place. That's their fight. That's their to what end. And at the point that they achieve the ability to continue to get legal abortions, the fight is over. It is done. And here, African people still are suffering under these conditions. African women still getting our babies kidnapped. African men still being pushed into prisons, and African women still being sterilized on a daily basis, dying in the hospitals trying to give birth. That remains our reality, despite the fact that white women now have their reproductive rights, in their own hands, restored, what have you. And I really appreciate the point that President Yejide made about the question of this choice that we think is an individual or personal choice. Because when we really think about why most of us consider abortions in the first place, we look at the conditions that are imposed on us, and all of them relate back to colonialism. The economic situation, we're living in these dire conditions of poverty that make it impossible. We don't know how to provide, for our children. We don't know if we have the support for that. We don't know all these things. How is that a legitimate choice? How is that a choice to be able to confidently know I can bring life into this world and protect that life, nurture that life for it to be able to carry on and do what it's supposed to do? We don't have that choice. We haven't had it for 600 years, which is why we're saying that the African Revolution must be the thing that we're working to advance, because the colonial mode of production has to go. We have to be able to make true decisions for self-determination in our own hands. That's what we have to be able to do. And that's not something we can say right now. Whether Roe versus Wade is overturned or not, that's not something we can say. But the African Revolution can guarantee it. The destruction of the colonial mode of production can guarantee it, where the decisions and the futures can be genuinely determined for Africans by Africans. So that's what we're talking about today. And you have to be a part of that. That's a decision you can make today that is genuinely in your interest. It's to join the African Revolution, join the African People's Socialist Party, apsp.uhuru.org. So we're going to go ahead and take some questions. I'm going to bring our panelists back, Chairman Omali Yeshitela and President Yejide Orunmila. We're going to take some questions from our live audience. If you have some, go ahead and type them into the chat, because we want to pose them here. So we have a comment from Comrade Mwezi in San Diego, California, and asks, can President Yejide and Chairman speak to the solutions the party has taken to address the control of the state as it relates to the African family and African women in particular? And we've talked about some of these, but it'll be good for us to elaborate on some of those as well. So Uhuru, Chairman, and President Yejide. Okay, let me ask you to unmute because I can't hear you. There you go.
Yeah, Uhuru. So in the African National, the party has had a long history of African childcare collectives, and that stems back, from when I was a baby. You know what I mean? So like there has been a history and a trajectory in the party where the community building institutions that where the community have a responsibility for the rearing of African children, supporting African families, and making sure that African families are supported through creating networks of African people who can help with the childcare responsibilities that oftentimes are saddled on African women who have to confront these things by themselves. And then, so it's no different now with the African National Women's Organization and the work that we are doing with the Uhuru Kijiji Childcare Collective, which is the same sort of program when we work inside the community to build these networks of African people who will take up their responsibility to protect our community, protect our children, protect the families, protect women, and to ensure that any vulnerable things that take place in our community does not result in our children being taken by the state, and that we can actually support African women who may not have the resources to pay for $400 per child, every month for childcare costs. That's, particularly if you have more than one, obviously, if you have more than one child, that could be, all of your entire month's earnings. And so, and these types of things lead to African women leaving your child at home or by themselves to go out to work or to do all the things that really open us up to some of the contradictions that we have been aware of. So yeah, just creating the childcare collectives as one of the things, and also to protect our communities is the Arrest CPS campaign itself. We out here fighting for alongside African parents who are fighting for the children to be out of the custody of the state, and we have to create a real defense against that, because that is at the core of who we are. And if we allow our children to be taken into the clutches of the colonial state, and what does that say about us? So we have to be able to contend with that system. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you. Comment, President Yejide. I think that's an extremely important kind of response to that question. And I just want to contribute to that by reminding us again that we are really not looking at an issue of African women or African children or abortion. We're looking at the fact that we live under colonial domination. And the critical thing that we have to do is we really have to help African people see beyond colonialism. You said it earlier, Comrade President Yejide, that we don't know anything but colonialism. And the fact is that African people know we catch hell, and that's not enough. We have to be able to show the people a future beyond the hell that we catch in order to move them. We have to have organization down on the ground everywhere, every community we're located. It should be impossible for any interloper, any colonizer to bring their butts into our community. They're going to take somebody's child, even if it if it results in armed confrontation. That our community needs to recognize that that's not that woman's or that family's responsibility. That's our responsibility. It's a part of a continuum of hostility that was initiated against us at the introduction of Europeans, the colonial mode of production. So I think that's one of the fundamental things that we have to do, and to see that it's all interconnected. I mean, look at the situation. You said it so eloquently, Comrade Akili, I think, talking about the white left colonizers who love us conveniently when they need African women to, as examples, somebody to fight around the question of abortion rights, because it's for them that they're fighting. It is not for Africa. It is not for African people. It's for white people, white women. Because if it were for African people, then they'd do something about the birth control measures that's imposed on us against our will. And I'm not just talking about sterilization. I'm talking about the 1.5 million African people who are locked up in prisons throughout this country, which is a form of birth control beyond everything else that happens to us. But you don't see them. You don't hear them. All of a sudden, they can just love us in those instances where it serves their particular interests. And we have to be able to identify what our interests are and to fight for our interests. And our interests central to that is overturning this relationship we have with white power. There's nothing that's been offered to us by the white peace movement, the white left movement, or anything that actually contributes to the challenging the relations of power that exist between African people, and I'm saying specifically to this country right now, but African people and white people. What do they offer that challenges the relations that we have, the relations of power? They say, we want you to have this and we want you to have this, but nothing that challenges the relations of power that we have. Africans are not supposed to have power over our own lives. That's an assault on colonialism and the colonial mode of production. So, Comrade Yejide, mentioned the things that we've been doing forever, and what people who can't do those things wherever you're located are not prepared at this moment for any number of reasons. You can support it. You can support the doula program that we are initiating right now in St. Louis this spring for African women coming from our communities who will learn to be doulas and who can participate in bringing children safely into existence, getting rid of those doctors, et cetera, who demand that every woman has to have a cesarean in order to give birth, like that somehow the normal, natural way of giving birth is out of style because it interferes with tee-off times at the golf course that the doctors have to make, or you must join in this struggle against the so-called child protective services that's stealing, kidnapping our babies. When you know of something like that's happening or about to happen, you have to put up a storm, even if you can't come out, even if you're not willing to come to the mother's house or the parent's house to fight to keep our children. You need to be on the phone with somebody. You need to be complaining, about this. You need to support, like in various places, because it's a complete question. It's not just a question of abortion rights. It's a question of feeding, clothing, housing ourselves, about being able to produce life for ourselves. But so we, in Philadelphia, where we have a market, that serves the purpose of African people being able to come and spend with each other so that some money can circulate in the community that can help us to hire people and do other kinds of things that we need. Same thing is true in St. Louis. We do these things. You need to support it. And if you can't do some of the other things that we are talking about, and you need to look into the possibilities wherever you're located. You got a neighbor, you got some neighbors, and you know people have children, and you can participate in doing and getting together and doing and collectively taking care of children. So in the isolation, who is your next door neighbor? Do you know her? Do you know his name? Do you ever have a discussion with them? Meet them, and let's begin to have these kinds of relationships that's necessary for us to forward our own interests. So, I mean, those are some of the things that can be said. I appreciate what Comrade Yejide said up to now about that.
For real, Chairman, and thank you, President Yejide. And I also appreciate this because it's practical work, even the work of just getting to know your neighbors and being a part of the, creating this culture within our community to protect the forces within our community. That's not something abstract. That is something people can practice, today, and joining the African National Women's Organization is something you can do today, building the Uhuru Kijiji Child Care Collective, supporting the work of the Black Power Blueprint and the Doula Project. These are actual things you can do today as a part of, moving this discussion where we're saying the solution is to destroy the colonial mode of production. So thank you, Comrade Mwezi, for this question as well. I want to move to Comrade Siali in Oakland, California. He asks, can this push by colonial capitalism for the end of abortion also be based on keeping a steady reserve workforce to keep white power imperialism alive despite its inevitable death? That's Siali's question. He doesn't specify to who it's to. So.
Well, the thing is, I think that is an issue. When you talk about the Comrade Siali, I think that the whole demographic challenge that's being experienced, the reproduction of the population, that the fact is that white women are not having enough babies to reproduce the population. There's a declining in the population that has serious economic issues attached to it. It's not just happening with white people, it's happening in some other places around the world too. And they can see shortly down the line, there's some countries that don't deal with immigrations and things like that. They're opposed to immigration because that's part of the white nationalist crisis as well. And so they don't want any other workers, but they are not producing children. And that's what Germany tried to do when Merkel, who was the chancellor, brought all those people from Syria into Germany, thousands. I think she was talking about 80 to 100,000 Syrians, because the Germans are not producing enough to function as a optimal labor force. This is a contradiction that they're facing with, and so I can see the abortion issue certainly is a factor, and it's more than that. It's that, Comrade Siali, but even it has a real serious implication for the psyche of the colonizer. Like that's why you've seen the demonstrations. You will not replace us. You will not replace us. White people marching down the streets. Why are you worried about being replaced? Because they're disappearing. And we have nothing to do with what's happening in your bedrooms and why you're not having babies and things like that. But that is a contradiction. But that's one of the reasons, and that's a tie to the labor issue as well, Comrade Siali. That's one of the reasons that even abortion clinics have been bombed and abortion providers have been killed and things like that. Wasn't for us, it's for maintaining a stable population workforce and a sense of personal existential crisis for the colonizers, for white people as a people. That's part of what's at work. And you see it plays itself out all the time. All the time it's playing itself out. People don't talk about it in terms of policy debates, that you don't hear that when you hear these discussions, but those are some of the unspoken factors that contribute to how Africans and other colonized people are treated inside this country and around the world.
Uhuru, thank you. Comrade Siali, thank you. Chairman Yejide, did you have anything for that question? Or?
Yeah, I think when the chairman was talking about the acknowledgement that white women are not having enough babies, there's this general understanding, I think, particularly with some organizers, activists, that by a certain year that white people in this country will be the minority and colonized people will be the majority. And so what do you do in those instances where, when those colonized folks was going to take over? And I think that the white power has already been cultivating, their reproduction of themselves through that process as well. And even the whole question of like the immigration struggle is really central to that, right? Like how, they say that you can't come to my country and they're closing off the border, and all of these things are really just the crisis that white people are experiencing with the diminishing numbers and all of that. So I just, it just popped up in my head in terms of like the crisis that white people are experiencing in regards to, their own mortality and their own population.
That's one of the reasons too that they love to see themselves reproduced in African forces. I mean, even when you look at the educational system, how African children are pushed out of the system, and it's only a minority of African, especially African men who can graduate high school, is because they're cultivating a group of neo-Obamas and things like that, and the rest of us. And so it's a way that the system reproduces itself even in Black skin, because they talk like and act like and preserve, like the identity of whiteness in their Black cells,
Yeah. For real. To that immigration question, I was just going to mention but they don't have a difficult time letting in people from Ukraine. So, there's this likeness there. And I also just appreciate that because it's a material basis for what's happening. There's not a subjective, thing, despite what the opinions of, might be within it. The fact of the matter is white power is not moving purely off some subjective anti-woman sentiment. It's rooted in something, and that's what we're talking about. It's rooted in the colonial mode of production. So
even the anti-woman sentiment that exists in the white society is rooted in something.
Yes.
Material basis for that. And dumb white feminists and otherwise don't get it. And they fight to protect the system tooth and nail from me and from African people and from you. And they're right, because my objective is to bring it down, so they can get on the right side of history and, miss a trial date, something like that.
Chairman. All right, so just a couple more questions. Comrade Mwezi, I thought, had another good question. She goes, can the panelists speak to what is the African Internationalist stance on people who say this is a women-only matter, to suggest that men should or cannot play a role in fighting this battle? As African internationalists, what conclusions must be made on these types of statements, understanding that what affects the African woman affects the African child, affects the African man, affects the African community?
Yeah, that's bass backwards. I mean, the whole thing is that, when we talk about the motive force in society as a production and reproduction of life, part of what we are talking about is reproducing ourselves as a people. And you can't do that by yourself. As much fun as some people may have trying it by themselves, it really takes a relationship between African men and women to make that happen. There's no way in hell the African nation can survive. This is not to say that all African people are smart. I would really like to be able to say that. I'd like to say all Africans are smart, but that's not the case. Some Africans are stupid and make the mistake of assuming that somehow we can live as African men without African women, or something that threatens the existence of African people if it targets African women is something that only African women should be concerned about. But that's not right. I mean, we are materialists, and we recognize that, and it's an assault on the African nation. And to the extent that they can fracture our consciousness and make us think like they think, that somehow we exist separate from each other, then they will be successful. That's the fight that we're involved in, Comrade Mwezi.
Yejide, did you have anything?
Nope, Chairman said it. Bass backwards.
Uhuru. Yeah, and on a similar note, I think that what you were saying too, Chairman, particularly around this whole slogan, "My body, my choice," you know, and just how, first of all, unrealistic that is, considering, as you said, we're social beings, but also how hypocritical that statement is, because of the fact that African people have not had a choice or autonomy over our body or any kind of decision-making power for 600 years when it comes, you know, consent, all this stuff. We did not consent to being enslaved, to being raped, for our babies being cut out of our wombs. We didn't consent. There was no autonomy for our bodies or anything like that. So yeah, just these, you know, just continue.
Yeah, they like to remind us that happened a long time ago. And you know, usually, you know, when they're talking about themselves, they brag about stuff that happened a long time ago. They call it history. You know what I mean? And they build institutions and whole department at universities dedicated to that. But when we start talking about the historical relationship between us and colonizers, that it's not something that they want to deal with. And that's part of what we mean when we say opportunism, to sacrifice the long-term interests of the class, of the people, for a short-term advantage for the petty bourgeoisie, to be able to say that, you know, they're fighting for this question, but not tackling colonialism, which is the foundation for all the oppression, all the exploitation. I'm going to say the most significant contradictions in the world is that existing between colonizer and colonized nations, oppressed and oppressor nation. That's the fundamental contradiction. And it is not to say that there are no contradictions between among the colonized, or that there are no contradictions among the colonizers. What it says, the main contradiction, the one around which every other contradiction revolves, is the contradiction between oppressed and oppressor nations. Therefore, it says that our responsibility is to attack the primary contradiction. If we are conscious, if we are revolutionary forces, if we have any sense of science, we attack the primary contradiction. And in the process of doing that, we also begin the assault on the secondary contradictions that might exist in our communities, between men and women, between homosexuals, heterosexuals, and the whole bit. But that primary contradiction has to be our primary focus as a part of the process to cure all the ills that impact human society. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. Oh, yeah, Yejide, were you about to say something?
Yeah, this whole discussion, there is a show on this platform called Hulu called Handmaid's Tale. It is based on a book that was written by a white woman feminist, no, I'm sure, that basically says how the United States becomes this sort of dictatorship, federation of white men that forces white women to procreate, those who can produce, and force white women overall. And the main character is some sort of reimagining of a Harriet Tubman sort of figure out here rescuing all the children who have been trapped by this system. And, you know, these, it's really infuriating to watch it, but I just wanted to mention that because this is how, you know, left colonizer women are really using propaganda as a way to, win allegiance from women everywhere, when in fact that this show couldn't raise anything about the contradictions of African people and every other body in it. Somehow colonialism disappeared, except, you know, somehow the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor nations disappeared. But the only contradiction was one between the men and the women who were forced to produce, while other women who could not produce sat over them while their husbands raped those women. It's an incredibly disturbing show, but it is, I think it really falls into this this whole this abortion question, and also, you know, the my body, my choice sort of thing that feminists are putting out there in the world, and the propaganda supporting that to try to win women all, to join forces against, this attack against womanhood.
But the thing is that's really important about that is it's only possible because the colonial mode of production is not recognized.
Yep.
It's
Yes.
only possible because
Yes.
the colonial mode of production is not recognized. It's not even a factor. Nobody even talks about Black people. When you listen to these discussions that's happening about pundits who are talking about, foreign policy, international relations and stuff like that, how the world is going to look. When you're reading Foreign Affairs and any of these other journals, Africa is not even a factor. There's no factor at all because we are not visible. And we're not visible because we're not recognized as the base upon which all of this rot rests. And that's the thing that's going to be advantageous for us, and depending on the success and the urgency with which the party can take in putting ourselves out around the world. And I want all of the people who are participating in this event now to recognize that the African People's Socialist Party is preparing to govern. I want to be clear on that. Everything we're doing is preparation to govern, to have power, to make the laws for African people, to establish what our relationships are going to be with each other and with the peoples around the world. We are preparing to govern. And we are saying that the African working class has that responsibility. And now that it has its own advanced detachment, its own revolutionary organization, it's capable of taking on that mission. And you should be joining with that mission. If you can not join, then you should support that mission. And if you can't support it openly, then support it secretly. By whatever means it's possible for you to do that, that's what you have to do. We have to break free from this whole social system that makes a determination of whether our babies can live or can't live, because the Supreme Court shouldn't have that right. The white power shouldn't have that right. None of these institutions shouldn't have that right. But in order for us to achieve that right, we're going to have to acquire collective power over our own existence. And that can only happen if we have an organization that is created for the purpose of taking power, not just for criticizing the bad things happening to us, but our objective is to take power. And if you're not talking about power, then it means that you're willing to continue to live like this forever, to live with all kinds of disease as a consequence of being uncertain and scared and not knowing whether your child is going to come back alive from the shop or the store or the mall, et cetera, whether or not your husband is going to get out on parole or whether somebody's going to go to prison. These are the kinds of contradictions that make you sick all the time. And, Frantz Fanon was absolutely correct when he said the colonized can only be cured by killing the colonizer. And the mission has to be to destroy colonialism and to free ourselves. I just wanted to, Uhuru.
Her chairman, her president Yejide, I mean, that was almost like a perfect wrap. I mean, that, this discussion has been so incredible, and there are, more comments and questions coming in. This one is from, and I mean, most of the stuff we have already been dealing with at this point. I do want to bring this question here because it also just makes some really important observations as well. So this is from Comrade Mosamela, says, white left women colonizers have generally used the oppression of African women by colonial capitalism to achieve their own political objectives. Abortion is not the only issue. Studies show that there is far more parity in the wealth of white women to white men than there is white women to African and other colonized women. In fact, African women and African men are practically identical. Yet the white left uses this statistic that a woman makes 77 cents for every dollar a white man makes, and that obscures the fact that white women make way above that and African women make way less than that. The true figures define the material need for African national liberation. I know that this is a lot, but can you speak to this? This is the real question at hand. White women want to be freed at the expense of African people and at the hands of African women. Yeah, we've been speaking to it, but President Yejide.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I like to refer back to this thing that I wrote that talks about like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, and even though it's existed way beyond this point where the white women abolitionists used the enslavement of African people to platform off, into their own thing in terms of suffrage and voting rights for women, and use that also as a platform to attack African women who actually decided that they wanted to stand in unity with African men in achieving this right to vote in the United States. And that they have always, white women have always, without fail, try to recruit African women into the issues that they wanted to push forward, because they couldn't do it by themselves. They couldn't do it just on the basis of being a white woman. They require, as a basis for their struggle, to include the issues and contradictions that they have imposed on African women as a way to struggle for something that they want. And as soon as they get it, as soon as they get that feet up, there's nothing for African women. So, I mean, this is just a long trend, and that's just a long, this is just an example of like the oppressor colonize a nation and the oppressed colonized nation. And, and what, it robs from us every single day, the parasitism that is inherent in colonial mode of production that will take from African people all the time. And so yeah, so that's what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, well, I think that's right on, because we talk about how subtler white left women do that, and I was talking to Carmen Masamela, who raised that question, perhaps today or yesterday, about how you look at this thing with I think his name was Henry Lloyd Garrison, this great white abolitionist, and who recruited Frederick Douglass to write in Garrison's newspaper. But Douglass broke the rules because he started talking about, the reality of, and what everything meant for African people, et cetera. And Garrison was upset, said, I don't want you to do that. I just want you to talk about how badly you get treated, how badly, but we don't want any editorializing. We don't want your opinions about the reality, et cetera. And that's the parasite, that's the parasitism. Garrison building his own newspaper, of course, Douglass had to create his own newspaper, but this is the parasite and it's inherent in this relationship that we have. I think it's important. I want to give another example, because something that's really important has transpired. Sundiata Acoli was just granted probation, they say a parole, and I hope that it comes through. Because Sundiata is an incredible human being, incredible soldier, and somebody who laid his life on the line for the liberation of our people when he was a very young person. He's 85 years old now. He was arrested in 1973, along with Assata Shakur on the New Jersey Turnpike. And and you think about the audacity of a government to lock up an African for trying to win freedom and to criminalize that person. Of course, it's the same government that put a $2 million bounty on Assata Shakur, who is only free now because the Cuban government has supported her and has given that kind of support to our own struggle. When you look at Julius Assange, you look at, I've forgotten the name of Chelsea Manning, and these are people who are also political prisoners, and I sympathize with them. But you don't ever, even as you hear the white left talking about Assange and Chelsea Manning, they don't say nothing about Sundiata. They don't say nothing about the members of the Black Liberation Army, because you can solve the problems associated with Assange and Manning's arrest because you support the system, the democracy, the right to free speech, the right to this and that, within the system. When you support the Black Liberation Army, when you support Sundiata Acoli, you're supporting the attack, the struggle against the system, to overturn the system itself. And so that's what we mean also about this whole parasitic thing, and how there is a left that's always willing to utilize the struggle of African and oppressed people to further their own aims and interests, but have no interest in actually overturning the oppression of colonialism, ours or anybody else's. So, Uhuru.
Uhuru. And I really appreciate you just raising the question of Comrade Sundiata Acoli as well in the context of this whole discussion. We're just going to take one more question, and then we'll go into some closing remarks and announcements. And, I could also help to answer this as well. This is coming from Inlela in Occupied Azania. Says, greetings, Chairman. Perhaps this was addressed a while back. You speak a lot of the colonial mode of production. If possible, could you kindly provide a list of books/articles that deal with this directly, and maybe one day have a study dealing with this too? And I know that you have done Colonialism as a Mode of Production series that is available on the Burning Spear TV YouTube channel. So depending on where you're viewing from now, go on over to YouTube to check out that series on colonialism as a mode of production. Chairman, I don't know if you wanted to answer that with some recommendations as well.
No, I thought that was good in terms of the recommendations. But the other thing I would say is it would be difficult to find anything on the colonial mode of production because it's never been addressed before. People talked about modes of production and they moved from what they characterize as primitive communism or communalism, and they talked about slavery, meaning what happened with Europe, what we now know as Europe, and they talked about feudalism, which was this European phenomenon, and then they leaped over some process to get to capitalism. And this leap they made was facilitated by what Karl Marx referred to as the primitive accumulation of capital. And we say is actually a colonial mode of production. And to the extent that we buy into that primitive mode, that primitive accumulation of capital as this bridge, this interim from feudalism to capitalism, then we become a part of somebody else's history. We become invisible to ourselves and to everybody else who accepts some definition of movement in history from Europe to capitalism, because you can't get there without stepping on a lot of Black people, a lot of indigenous people, et cetera. So I think you should pay attention to what Comrade Akili just offered as examples. And we're going to be talking more and more and more about that in the days and weeks to come. Uhuru.
Uhuru. And I do want to recommend reading Chairman Omali Yeshitela's An Uneasy Equilibrium, and also Vanguard, where the chapters of the question of the nation as well as African internationalism appear, that is dealing with the colonial mode of production. And of course, we'll have more that deepens that as well. So, but thank you, Ndela. And thank you to all of you who've been tuned in with us during this discussion, who raised your questions, put in your comments, supported this discussion so far. And I want to go ahead and just turn it over to our panelists for some closing remarks before I leave you guys with announcements. So President Yejide, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I just really appreciate this discussion around the abortion, but just the way that we as the party opened it up so that African people can really understand that the question for us isn't just abortion, or is it abortion really? It is the colonial mode of production. It is the destruction of colonialism as the way that forward, and that despite what the colonizer does in their institutions, that we have the ability to bring this whole thing down, to actually create the life that we need that will support life, and I just really appreciate that, and appreciate the chairman and all of African internationalism and everything that has been offered here so far. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Well, thank you so much, Comrade Director Akile. Thank you, Comrade President Yejide, for this participation in this incredibly significant discussion. And I think one of the things that we did with this discussion is demonstrate that philosophy affects everything, and that we talk about African internationalism. There's no discussion that can be held that is not addressed by African internationalism philosophy. There's no such thing as some kind of Black theory or Black philosophy that does not engage in how the world is what it is, how it came into being, existence. And so there's some people who talk about the Black thing as though somehow it exists in some vacuum, separate and apart from the rest of the world. But we are saying that over the last 600 years, Africa has been central, and Black people have been central to the development of the whole world. There's a book that's recently written in terms of how Africa and African people are responsible for what is characterized as modernity today. The whole modern world has come into existence as a consequence of what has happened with Africa and African people. And I want us to accept responsibility for that. That's what we're asking people to do, to accept responsibility for that, to accept responsibility for breaking all of these chains, physical and psychological and ideological chains that keep us locked into this relationship with the colonial mode of production. Don't forget the colonial mode of production, because that's critical to everything that we're talking about. And so I just want to say that and thank everybody for participating in this discussion. Thank you, Comrade Director Akile. Thank you, Comrade President Yejide Orunmila. And I want to just salute you again for that incredible mobilization that I was able to participate in on Sunday. That just really opened the door to this critical question of the theft of our children by this iteration of slavery kidnapping that's called Child Protective Services, that the kidnapper is now going to protect our children from us in our community. What? Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much. That's our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and the African National Women's Organization President Yejide Orunmila. To learn more and to join ANWO, visit ANWO Uhuru, that's ANWO Uhuru.org, and to join the African People's Socialist Party, visit APSP-Uhuru.org. Now we're going to go into some closing announcements, get those up on screen for you just to let you know some important events coming up. So we have African Liberation Day just right around the corner, taking place May 28th and 29th, and featuring festivals and conferences in cities across the world. This year's African Liberation Day events will recognize the founding of the African People's Socialist Party in 1972 with the theme Relentless, 50 Years of Leadership Toward African Redemption. Learn more at alduhuru.org or call 727-914-3617 to get information on the African Liberation Day in your region. And make sure to like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every live stream with Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Support the work of Chairman by donating now at paypal.me/OmaliTaughtMe. And if you are interested in volunteering with the Chairman's public relations team, please email volunteer@omaliyeshitela.org. So that will do it for our announcements. For any others, please visit theburningspear.com/events to see everything else we've got going on upcoming. And again, just really want to salute everyone for participating in this incredible discussion. The position that we have to take is clear: to destroy the colonial mode of production, to take this whole colonial system off the backs of African people everywhere. That is the solution. Join the African Revolution. That is a legitimate decision that we can make today, right now. So thank you all so much. Again, salute our leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and we'll catch you all this Sunday for Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru, Vanguard.
Uhuru. Vanguard.